I'm Scrapbook Boxing, and I would love to have a conversation with you about the conversations that I had with my dad, sitting around the scrapbook tables on a weekly basis. You see, my dad and I, for over 35 years, we would build what is now considered one of the largest scrapbook collections in the world. And my dad and I built those scrapbooks from the age of 7 till just recently when he would transition in 2005. When I was 7 years old, my dad would take me to a magazine store. It's located on Chambers Street, in Lower Manhattan. That magazine store was going out of business. My dad would send me over to the wrestling section because he knew I loved wrestling. See, my mom would allow me to stay up to 12 midnight. That's when wrestling would come on a Saturday, right at the Harness Racetrack. And that was a big deal because during that time, you had Bruno Sammartino was scheduled to face Billy Graham, superstar. Bruno Sammartino would take the title away from Gorilla Monsoon. You had wrestlers such as Sergio Oliva. But superstar Billy Graham was the new face in wrestling. He would walk around with an Indian headdress. He had a brother by the name of Luke Graham. And that's the magazine I saw when I was standing in front of the magazine section of the store. And I had to get that magazine. I had to read it. I had to look at it. I had to feel it. So there was a crate that was sitting on the floor. Had old magazines in it. I picked up the crate, tossed out the old magazine, flipped up the crate upside down, and stood on it. I still was not tall enough to reach the magazine, so I stood on my tippy toes and reached and stretched as far as I could. Grab onto the magazine with my fingertips and pull and yank, and finally the magazine would free itself. And I looked at that magazine and I couldn't believe what I had in my hand. But as I looked over to my right, magnificent artwork on covers of magazines that I was totally unfamiliar with. So I reached a little further, and I was able to grab one, then two, then four, then 8. And I was so intrigued that the weight of my body would knock down the shelf, and all those magazines I was reaching for would now be on the floor. We create a tremendous sound that would cause the entire store to come visit me. And as I'm on the floor, I'm looking at all these magazines, not paying any attention to all the people watching me. The owner of the store came around the corner. He wanted to see what the noise was about. And when he saw I was interested in the magazines that were all over the floor, he grabbed the crate that I was standing on, flipped it upside down, scooped up all the magazines and put it on a crate. And he took them to the front of the store. Those magazines were boxing ring magazines from the 1920s. And on the cover, you had fighters such as Billy Patrol, the Fargo Express, Jimmy McLarnin, the babyface assassin, Barney Ross, who was a 2-time champion. You had Tony Canzoneri and Joe Louis, Max Melling, Jack Dempsey, Manasseh Moeller, Gene Tunney, the Fighting Marine. They called Max Melling the Black Yulin. Jack Sharkey, who was known as the Boston Gob. When my dad came around to see what the noise was about, he saw I was in front of the store with the owner. And the owner told my dad, this young man is interested in these magazines. Is he your son? My dad said, yes, he is, but he's not going home with all these magazines. And I couldn't believe what I heard from my dad. So the owner said to my dad, are you concerned about the price? He said, yes. He said, don't worry about it. It's 75% off. I will make sure that your son goes home with these magazines. Now, there were over 50 magazines. And as I was like a kid in a candy store, I couldn't believe it. My heart was pumping. Mouth was dry. And the store owner saw that. And he asked the obvious question, do you want more of these magazines? And I looked at him as to say, are you serious? You're going to ask me that question? He said, well, I have a store on the other street, on Reed Street. It's an annex to this store. And it's about 50 more boxes full of these kinds of magazines. Ring magazines from the 1920s was in the crate that was waiting for me in front of the store by the cashier. I'm 7 years old. So my dad sacrificed the magazines that he had in his hands. You see, my dad was a handyman. He was in the mechanic section where you had electrical appliances, plumbing, painting, repair radios. All that information he gave up for me. And he took me to his house, separated from my mom when I was 5 years old. My dad lived in Brooklyn, New York, East New York, to be exact. Pennsylvania Avenue and Euclid. It was known as Pink Houses. And we went to his apartment and his closet. I couldn't believe what I saw. You see, my dad was very private. But he was into boxing and I never knew. He had over 20 huge boxes of newspapers and articles and clippings and photos and boxing cards. And as curious as I was in the store, I was just as curious at my dad's house. In that closet, on the top shelf, there was a magazine that was hanging out from the top of the shelf. Once again, I would climb up that closet and I would grab a hold of that box and the box would fall down. And newspaper clippings would float around like rain and snow, and they were scattered all over the floor. My dad was furious because he spent countless hours organizing the clippings. So he scooped up the articles and put them on a huge table, and I had to help him organize these articles. I'm 7 years old. But in doing so, I ran across articles that I would never forget. You see, a lot of these clippings was from the Boxing Blade, Police Gazette, Boxania, Ring magazines from the 1920s, Knockout magazines from the 1920s, West Coast magazines, various newspaper clippings from all over the world. You see, my dad was in the military, and he traveled all over the world. He was in World War II and the Korean War. So every time he ran across a magazine, he would send it back. It would be waiting for him. And he did that the entire time he was in the military. He would cut out those newspaper articles, those clippings, anything containing to boxing. So as we were going through those clippings on the table in his home, we ran across articles from Sam Langford, Harry Wills, Larry Temple and Jack McVeigh. Now, Larry Temple was the creator of the Bolo Punch. Jack McVeigh was known as the Pride of Harlem. He was a colored middleweight champion. And he would take on the Harlem Thunderbolt, Harry Smith, 1929. And that would be a fight that you would not believe. Panama Joe Gans and Harlem Thunderbolt, as I said, Harry Smith. Joe Jeanette and Larry Estridge, Kid Norfolk, and George Godfrey. John Lester Johnson, tell you about him. He was from Suffolk, Virginia, 1895. Between 1915 and 1916, he would take on Jack Dempsey, known as the Manasseh Mauler. He would crack two of Jack Dempsey's ribs, although Jack Dempsey was just getting his career started. But John Lester Johnson would give Jack Dempsey the business. He would give him the business. Jack Dempsey never forgot about that. He would never give a black fighter an opportunity once he became heavyweight champion of the world. And it was because of that article I wanted to study and learn more about black fighters. As you can see here, Kid Norfolk, who is to your left, is squaring off with Harry Greb, who's to your right. They would fight each other in 1921, fought twice. And this was the fight that they would say Kid Norfolk would thumb Harry Greb. Harry Greb would fight 47 more fights, blind in one eye. He would die in 1926, but he would lose his title to Tiger Flowers, the Georgia Deacon, in 1926. Harry Greb would take on Gene Tunney to fight him in ring. Fought him 5 times. And he would defeat Gene Tunney, 1922. He would become the America's light heavyweight champion of the world. The following year, 1923, he would take on Johnny Wilson from Harlem. And he would now become the world's middleweight champion. Harry Greb would be known as the Pittsburgh Windmill. Articles like that is what intrigued me. Wanted to know more. So as I read on, I would look at articles with William Landon Jones. His name was William Gorilla Jones. He was born May 12, 1906 in Memphis, Tennessee. He died January 4th, 1982. He was 75 years of age at the time of his death, and he stood 5'9". He was a middleweight and had a 75-inch reach. And then when he retired, he would be a caddy, as well as a chauffeur for Mae West. 1928, at the age of 22, he would meet Mae West in a New York nightclub. He would earn $100,000 in boxing, and he would bet it all in one night. You see, William Gorilla Jones would walk a lion cub. He would have a pinstripe suit, shiny wingtip shoes, gold pin sticking through his tie, and matching cufflinks, and diamond rings, and a long pocket watch. He would become a world middleweight champion. You see, the toy bulldog Mickey Walker would relinquish his title, the title that he would win when he took on Tiger Flowers. Very controversial decision, I might add. You had 3 black fighters in the top 5. William Gorilla Jones. He had a fighter by the name of Harry Smith, who was the Harlem Thunderbolt. Oh, what a puncher he was. He had a record of 65-0 with 55 knockouts as an amateur. He would win a Canadian middleweight championship belt, the Metropolitan AAU middleweight championship belt. The next man from Harlem that would win that title would be Walker Smith, better known as Sugar Ray Robinson. Win that title as a bantamweight in 1938. I would look at articles with fighters such as Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Larry Temple, Larry Temple was the creator of the Bolo Punch. And then you would have Seferino Garcia, Bo Jack, Kid Gavilan, Miguel Barrios. All brilliant Bolo punchers. Larry Estridge and Kid Norfolk. Norfolk was known as William Ward. I would study Bobby Dobbs, who stood 5 foot 8 inches and weighed 125 to 136 pounds. He would be in the ring with Frank Childs and Charlie Martin, George Kid Lavin, and Harron the Black Pearl Martin. Charles Hadley, he was a professor, had his own school. Black Frank Taylor. I would study the colored middleweight champions, the Harlem Thunderball Harry Smith. He defeated Jack McVeigh, who was known as the Pride of Harlem. Fought him in 1929. You see, Harry Smith wanted to become a dentist, but he also wanted to become a fighter. He was a hell of a fighter. Have him the greatest middleweight champion in my estimation of all times. Although he was a colored middleweight champion, won that title. But I have him, if not the first, the second greatest middleweight champion of all time. You would have Larry Estridge and George Byers, Frank Craig the Harlem Coffee Cooler, Sam Langford. He would be known as the Boston Tar Baby, Boston Bone Crusher. Jamaica Kid and Charlie Burley, Eddie Palmer and Harry Martin, Panama Joe Gans and Holman Williams, Coco Kid and Ed Bentley. You have Frank Craig the Harlem Coffee Cooler, who would defeat March 18th, 1893, George Butler. Joe Butler was out of Philadelphia. He would lose to Dan Creedon, October 14th, 1895. It would be for the middleweight championship crown of England. Frank Craig would defeat George Christian, November 24th, 1898. 13 rounds, he would knock him out. Very interesting articles that I would come across. The Fighting Gorilla, Gorilla Jones, welterweight from 1913 to 1924. He would defeat Eddie Palmer on points. February 1915, he would win the World Colored Welterweight Championship belt. Eddie Palmer, who would eventually lose his crown, the Welterweight Championship belt, to the Coco Kid. The Coco Kid would face Holman Williams 14 times. He would defeat him 9 times. He would become the welterweight and the middleweight in the colored division. My dad and I ran into an article with a fighter by the name of Jack Chase. His name was Young Joe Louis. His name was Isaac James Chase. Isaiah James Chase was born January 24th, 1914, Sherman, Texas. He died March 23rd, 1972. He was 58 years of age at the time of his death. And he began boxing at St. Mary's Auditorium. That's in Walsburg, Colorado. He fought a guy by the name of Billy Pryor. January 30th, 1936. He defeated him in 4 rounds. He would have 24 fights between January 30th, 1936 and December 28th, 1936. Between January 25th, 1937 and December 7th, 1937. He would have 14 fights. He would face fantastic fighters such as Juan Zarita. And he would fight a beautiful fighter by the name of Jackie Bird. Eddie Booker and Charlie Burley. Lloyd Marshall and Holman Williams. Aaron Little Tiger Wade. Harry Kid Matthews. Archie Moore and Jimmy Garrison. Paul Lewis and Coco Kid. Oakland Billy Smith and Watson Jones. Kenny Watson and Bobby Zander. Big Boy Hughes. An outstanding fighter was Little Joe Louis. Or Young Joe Louis. His name was Jack Chase. Brilliant fighter he was. Got in trouble a lot. That was his problem. But he was an outstanding fighter. As my dad went through the various record books, he expected me to know when I left that home that day, a specific fighter. Had to know all about that fighter, his nickname, his birth name, his boxing name. Had to know his record. Had to know his losses. Had to understand the fighter himself. My dad would cover the upper body of the fighter, and through the foot and legs I had to know who the fighter was. My father drilled and drilled and drilled boxing into me. And we would watch reel-to-reels, Betamax, and VHS boxing tapes. We watched fights such as Joe Louis, Max Schmeling, June 22nd, 1938, New York's Yankee Stadium. You see, Joe Louis would suffer 72 straight right hands from Max Schmeling in 1936. But the 1938 fight would be one of the greatest heavyweight championship matches till this day. You see, Joe Louis fought with a vengeance. He would not be denied. He would crack the third and fourth vertebrae of Max Schmeling, so much that Max Schmeling would scream. He couldn't fall down. He would hold on to the ropes. He didn't understand why his left leg was numb, because his S1, L4, and L5 was disturbed. C1 and 2 was damaged. Oh, what a beating Max Schmeling would suffer that night. He'd wind up in Polyclinic Hospital, 10 days. Amazing. And we would watch that fight on video as we were putting together scrapbooks. As we were watching the Joe Louis and Max Schmeling fight, I ran across Dave Holly. He was born March 2nd, 1881. Pennsylvania, Westchester. Weighed between 133 to 140 pounds. Fought fighters such as Joe Gans and Jack Blackburn, Sam Bolden, and Belfield Longcott, Joe Walcott, and Sam Langford, Dixie Kid and George Cole, Ruff Turner and George Gunther, Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost. Now, Jeff Clark, who was he? He was born 1886 in Millville, New Jersey. Stood 5 foot 10 inches and weighed 165 to 193 pounds. Fought fighters such as Sam McVeigh and Kid Norfolk, Dixie Kid and Peter Muller, Joe Jeanette and Balling Levinsky, Harry Wills and Sam Langford. Read about fighters such as Charlie Burley. He was born September 6, 1917. Stood 5 foot 9 inches. Weighed 145 pounds to 162 pounds. He was in the ring with Little Tiger Aaron Wade, Burt Littell, and Holman Williams, and Jimmy Bivens, and Oakland Billy Smith, Lloyd Marshall, Jeff Clark. He was in the ring with Joe Carter, and Charlie Banks, Archie Moore, and Coco Kid, as well as Eddie Charles. Lloyd Marshall, June 14, 1914, Madison Square Garden. Really good fighter was Lloyd Marshall. He stood 5 foot 10 inches. He was an amateur. 212 fights, 17 losses. As a professional, 64 wins, 24 losses, and 32 knockouts. He was in the ring with Ken Oliver, Jeffrino Garcia, Lou Bullard, and Teddy Ure, Cole Bobo Olsen, Eddie Babe Misco, Eddie Booker, Freddie Mills, Charlie Burley, Jack Chase, Holman Williams, Ezra Charles, Archie Moore, and Joey Maxim. I had to repeat things like this to my dad over and over again at the top of the head. It's the only way I would be able to come back to that house. Because if I didn't know the right answer, he would take me home immediately. That's how it was in my dad's house. We would go to Gleason's gym. There we would be greeted by Calvin. At that time, he was the doorman. He was friends with Emil Griffith. And you would see men walking around Gleason's gym, such as Vito Anafirmo, Emil Griffith, Carlos Ortiz, Kenny Lane. I remember the first time I met Al Gavin, famous cut man. Met him through Teddy, who was a Jewish friend of mine. I began meeting historians. And they would tell me things that you couldn't read in a book anywhere. I would go over to Totowa's gym, called it Lenny Shaw's Boxing Gym, located on Totowa Avenue, right off of Union Avenue. There you would find Paul Cavalier, his brother Art Cavalier, Ace Murata, and the things they would tell me. I met up with Georgie Benton, because not too far from there was Main Events, My brother Curtis Anderson worked not too far, about a block away from main events. Kurt and I have conversations all the time about this. We laugh about it today. About Rocky Lockridge. And a lot of the old-time fighters that came up in the past. See, Curtis can relate just like I could. His dad would set up reel-to-reels for him when he was 7 years old and drill him. Made sure he understood the game of boxing. Boxing is a great sport. And as I put those articles together, week after week, page after page, I would build together with my dad memories that I would never forget. Today, the books that I have are worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we did it for fun. Have articles of fighters that no longer exist. Harry Greb has his own book, 1,000 pages, 2,000 front and back. Articles you can't find anywhere. Information that a lot of historians don't know about. Sam Langford has his own book. Tiger Flowers has his own book. Harry Smith has his own book. Archie Moore has 2 books. Joe Louis has 10 books. I have 10,000 articles of Joe Louis. Sugar Ray Robinson has 5 books. All 1,000 pages each. Ezzard Charles and Joe Walcott. You name the fighter. I have information on them. Now, my dad would train at Stillman's gym. And he had a locker next to Sandy Sadler. His name was Joe Sadler. He was born June 23rd, 1926 in Boston, Massachusetts. He died September 18th, 2001. He was 75 years of age at the time of his death. He stood 5 foot 8.5 inches. He had a 70-inch reach. He had a record of 163 total bouts, 145 wins, 104 losses, knockouts, 16 losses, and 2 draws. Fought from 1944 to 1956. You see, all the information that I recite to anyone is always at the top of my head. I never look at anything because it's embedded in me through my dad. And it wasn't an easy thing because I always disappointed my dad coming up. And I said one day I would never disappoint him. So I didn't see him for 2 weeks. And I studied and I studied. And I talked to old-time historians and they helped me understand what I was missing. And I went back to my dad. He was so impressed. Didn't get any record wrong. Didn't get any fighters' information wrong. From that point on, I said, I'm going to study this thing to its fullest. And I understood that Sandy Sadler fought Willie Pep 4 times. Met up with him September 26, 1951 at the Polo Grounds. And he stopped him 9 rounds out of 15. Junior lightweight champion. Sandy Sadler was a hell of a fighter. Had an older brother by the name of Dick Sadler. Now, Dick Sadler would be in the corner of George Foreman. And Sandy Sadler, who I had the pleasure of meeting, along with Jimmy Carter and Ike Williams and Bob Montgomery, along with Jersey Joe Walcott and Henry Armstrong and Sugar Ray Robinson, along with Charlie Burley. I met plenty of fighters in my day. And these fighters that I admire. All these conversations I had with my dad around the scrapbook table. You see, the fight records you had of yesterday was outrageous. If you look at Joe Jeanette, he was born August 26, 1876 in North Bergen, New Jersey. He died July 2nd, 1958 in Union City, New Jersey. He stood 5 foot 10 inches. He had a 74-inch reach, and he had a record of 166 total bouts. 83 wins, 10 losses, 69 knockouts, 10 draws. And he was stopped twice. See, Joe Jeanette had at least 100 bare knuckle fights. Knock men out in the street cold. Grab the money and leave the man laying there and walk the opposite way. He was incredible. He had Sam Langford, known as the Boston Bone Crusher, born March 4th, 1886, in Weymouth Falls, Nova Scotia, Canada. He died January 12th, 1952. 1956. Boston, Massachusetts. Sam Langford had well over 500 fights. They have on record 252 fights, 178 wins, 29 losses, 126 knockouts. That is incorrect. Sam Langford had over 500 fights. He was in the ring with Jeff Clark, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Joe Gans, Gunboat Smith, Jack Blackburn and Porky Dan Flynn, Dave Holly, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Joe Walcott, Roughhouse Ware, Tiger Flowers, Fireman Jim Flynn, Andy Watson and Kid Norfolk, Jamaica Kid and Young Peter Jackson, Bill Tate and Larry Temple, Bowling Jim Johnson, Jack Thompson, Harry Wills, 22 times. He would defeat Harry Wills twice and he would lose to him 6 times and have 14 no decisions. Jim Barry, Jack Johnson, 1906, Bill Tate, Lee Anderson, and George Godfrey. What a remarkable fighter he was. Salute to my dad. Happy Father's Day. Lost my dad 2005. Perhaps we'll meet again one day. Dad, I love you. And all the fathers out there who did right by their children. Happy Father's Day. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights and all great fighters. And all great dads will never be forgotten on my channel. For more information on my content, you can catch me right here in the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. You can also find me on the 3 Wise Men of Boxing, Stormy B. Man, and my brother Kurt Sugar Anderson.